So you're trying to get a handle on these big, complex, global issues, right? Cut through all the noise. That's why we're here. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something pretty critical. How likely is civil conflict, like actually in Europe right now?
Yeah, it's a heavy question.
It is. And we've gathered a whole bunch of sources, expert forecasts, academic work, historical context, plus some current indicators that are, well, quite telling. Our mission here is basically to pull out the most vital stuff, the insights you really need, so you get a clearer picture without, drowning in data.
And what's really fascinating looking across all this material is how you see these different pressures all sort of converging on Europe at the same time.
Right, it's not just one thing.
No, exactly. You've got economic stress, big demographic shifts, politics getting more divided, and even these sort of localized bursts of extremist violence. To really grasp the potential for, wider unrest, we kind of need to see how these different threads might weave together, maybe even make each other worse.
Okay, let's kick off with the economy then. That's hitting so many people directly.
Okay.
I mean, back in 2022, the sources mentioned over 12,500 protests globally just on food and fuel costs.
Wow, that many.
Yeah, and a lot of that was right here in Western Europe.
Mm.
You remember Germany, spring 2023? They were calling them the largest walkouts in decades. Inflation was over 9% then. And France, severe street violence linked to pension protests, wage protests. It really feels like that economic pressure is a key undercurrent.
And connecting that to the bigger picture, S&P Global had an interesting take. They sort of suggested, well, maybe these protests won't totally destabilize things if major gas shortages are avoided.
Okay.
But they were very clear. Rising energy costs, inflation, those are absolutely critical drivers of unrest everywhere, and Europe's definitely not immune.
Absolutely. You see it across the EU, right? High inflation is just eating into people's real wages.
Yeah.
And those energy price spikes in 22, 23, fueled by, well, pandemic recovery set, but also significantly the war in Ukraine. We saw those images from Italy, didn't we? People literally burning energy bills in the street. That tells you something about the frustration level.
It really does. And it highlights how interconnected these things are. The Ukraine war, for instance, it wasn't just energy prices.
All right. Food, too.
Exactly. It pushed up food prices, messed with supply chains that were already kind of creaking. All these things just pile on, adding to that social discontent, that cost of living crisis.
And it's not only about the day-to-day costs. The sources also flag these resource bottlenecks, the energy crisis you mentioned. Governments stepped in massively.
They had to.
But the fact that different countries did different things, had different policies, that could actually fragment potential protest movements, couldn't it? Make it harder for them to unify around economic issues.
Precisely. Yeah, the experience of rising costs might be shared, but the national responses, the different safety nets, they can, well, break up that potential for a single continent-wide pushback. But we absolutely have to talk about the housing crunch, too. Spain is just a stark example. Over 150,000 people protesting last year, demanding rent controls.
After rents doubled in a decade.
Doubled. I mean, that's huge in such a short time.
And the sources link that to things like tourism, even migration, putting extra pressure on housing, even in places you'd think have strong economies.
Yeah.
It's not just broad trends. It's these really specific squeezes on basic needs like, well, having a roof over your head.
Indeed. And, while the sources mention things like water scarcity or climate disasters potentially making things worse, it's important they also note we're not currently seeing, the widespread famine conditions that historically triggered full-blown revolutions.
Okay, that's a key distinction.
It is. But the combination, inflation hitting incomes, energy costs causing uncertainty, not enough affordable housing that is definitely creating these intense pockets of grievance, makes the risk of localized riots, strikes, much higher.
Okay, so economic pressure, clearly a massive piece of the puzzle. What about the other big area the sources highlighted? Immigration and demographics.
Right. This is another huge layer. You've got this context of aging populations in Europe, shrinking working age groups in many countries.
Which means more reliance on migration.
Naturally, yeah, to fill labor gaps, support social systems. But the scale of recent migration is what's really striking.
Like the Ukrainian refugees.
Exactly. Over 6 million into the EU. Countries like Poland, Germany, Slovakia taking in huge numbers. These are unprecedented flows, and they inevitably create, social and logistical challenges.
And you see how these flows get, well, weaponized, right, by far-right groups. The sources say they're predicting, even trying to stir up anti-immigrant protests.
S&P Global specifically warned about that, yeah,
Mm-mm.
especially in countries that took in lots of Ukrainians. And tragically, we have seen some protests turn violent vandalism at refugee shelters, things like that. And it's worth remembering, this isn't entirely new for Europe. You've had migration flows from Africa, the Middle East for a long time, and those have also fueled polarization.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the actual numbers, like the European Commission said last year, only about 6% of EU residents are non-EU citizens.
Only 6%. Feels higher sometimes in the discourse.
Exactly. Because fringe parties often paint this picture of migrants as this huge economic burden, a cultural threat. It's a narrative.
And the sources connect this back to past unrest, don't they? Greece in 2011, Germany in 2015 with that refugee wave, the UK back in the 2000s, clashes in France, Italy.
Yeah, there's definitely a pattern where migration can become a flashpoint.
It seems like it's often the perception, maybe more than the reality, the perception that migrants are straining housing, jobs.
That's a really potent tool for far-right mobilization, absolutely, which just highlights how crucial government policy is, managing integration effectively, tackling housing issues properly so they don't fuel resentment. Otherwise, the sources suggest you risk more conflict between the state and, well, radical groups who feel ignored.
So the takeaway seems to be large-scale protests just about migration, or maybe still fringe.
Mostly, yeah.
But this increasing populism linked to immigration, that's consistently flagged as a top driver of potential unrest. That's worrying.
It absolutely is. And that leads us right into the next big theme, political polarization and extremism.
Right. We've definitely seen a surge in support for populist and specifically far-right parties across Europe.
Yeah, I mean, France's National Rally, Brothers of Italy, Germany's AfD, these aren't small fringe groups anymore in some places. Their electoral success shows a real deepening divide.
And it's not just the explicitly far-right, is it? That IFO analysis mentioned populism generally is rising. Voters seem more willing to back anti-establishment parties.
That kind of polarization, it just creates fertile ground for social tensions, doesn't it? And when the sources talk about populism here, it feels like it's this mix of economic complaints, cultural anxieties often tied to immigration, and just a general distrust of the system.
Yeah, that sounds right.
That's exactly what the Alliance Risk Barometer for 2025 picks up on. They rank civil unrest strikes, riots, as the #1 global geopolitical risk, and they specifically call out France and the UK.
Wow, #1 globally.
Yeah, and it's not only immigration driving that concern, it's also broader discontent over taxes, voting reforms, other policy stuff. And the sources add that, in countries with shaky coalition governments, even just having an election can become a flashpoint. Opposition groups might see it as a chance to, really mobilize.
Okay, so that's the political climate. But we also need to touch on the risk of, actual violence from extremists.
Yeah.
Criminal extremism, terrorism.
Definitely. And the sources show a pretty concerning trend there. Europol reported a huge jump in terrorist attacks in Europe, 63% up from 2023 to 2024. A lot of that linked to Islamist extremism.
63%. That's alarming.
It is. And if you dig into the EU's own report, the TSAT report from last year that gives the detailed breakdown for the continent, the numbers are stark. 120 incidents in 2023 compared to just 28 the year before.
28 to 120. Good grief.
Now, most of those incidents in 23 were actually separatist or left-wing anarchist related, but the jihadist attacks, while fewer, caused the most casualties, sadly.
Right.
And it's not just attacks. Arrests for terrorism offenses are up, too, a lot of those for suspected jihadist plots. And there's this rising concern about homegrown lone actors.
From both sides, right?
Yeah.
Islamist and far-right.
Both, yeah.
Yeah.
Plus, you've got cyber threats, hybrid threats complicating the whole security picture. What's particularly worrying, according to the sources, is how both jihadist and far-right extremists are expanding their activities, especially online, spreading radical ideas, pushing these accelerationist narratives.
Trying to speed things up, basically.
Exactly. And they even connect things like the war in Gaza to a heightened threat from Sunni extremist groups inside Europe.
So we're talking organized militias here, or?
Well, the experts we looked at seem to think that while these trends definitely raise the risk of isolated violent incidents, these micro-wars, as some might call them, they haven't really coalesced into, broader organized militia. Not yet, anyway.
Okay.
But you have this combination, more extremist activity, and a political climate where those anxieties get amplified. That can fuel broader unrest, even from isolated events.
So we've got the economic pressures, the immigration debates, the political polarization, the extremist threat. Bringing it all together, what's the overall expert assessment? Are we looking at civil war?
Well, the general consensus seems to be probably not full-blown civil war across the continent. That scenario is still seen as unlikely, thankfully.
Okay, that's reassuring, I guess.
But they are very clear that significant unrest, instability, that's definitely possible if these pressures keep building, or worse, interact negatively.
They talk about this idea of a polycrisis, right?
Exactly. This idea that we're facing multiple overlapping shocks, economic, social, geopolitical, all hitting at once. Understanding how they feed off each other is key.
And you saw that in things like the World Economic Forum survey.
Yeah.
Experts rating cost of living, political polarization as huge global risks.
Yeah, and Virus Maplecroft's Civil Unrest Index showed that sharp rise in protest risk globally, with Europe's levels staying high. Interestingly, they pointed to places like Bosnia, Switzerland, the Netherlands, seeing the biggest jump in risk back in late 2022.
Switzerland. That's surprising.
It is. Shows it's not just the usual suspects, perhaps. And remember, S&P Global's warning about protests if gas shortages hit, or Allianz ranking strikes and riots as the top risk this year, 2025, because of inflation and immigration tensions.
Even business surveys show it. Leaders rating civil unrest higher than other geopolitical threats.
Right. And it's not just current forecasting. Academic research backs this up. That Ponticelli and Volth study, looking at Europe from 1919 to 2008, found a clear link between economic distress, budget cuts, price shocks, and actual uprising.
History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, huh?
Something like that. Those historical examples, the French Revolution, Weimar Germany, they're stark reminders that extreme hardship plus a state that seems unable to cope, that can lead to massive upheaval.
So what are the experts predicting now? More like localized flare-ups.
Generally, yes. More protests, maybe more violent clashes, but localized stuff. Targeted attacks, clashes during big events, sporadic riots, that kind of thing. Not continent-wide war.
There's specific hotspots?
They tend to point towards France, parts of Eastern Europe, some southern EU countries as higher risk areas. Places with that mix of ongoing economic pain and deep political divisions.
It sounds like there's this balancing act for governments, social safety nets, dialogue that could help calm things down.
That's the hope, yeah. That seems crucial. Whereas a heavy-handed repressive response could just pour fuel on the fire.
Right.
And there's this underlying concern in the sources, too. If lots of Europeans are losing faith in traditional social democracy, well, the potential for ongoing unrest stays high unless policies really adapt to address those core grievances.
Thinking about those historical parallels again, what makes things different now? Why isn't Weimar happening again, according to the experts?
Well, a few key things. Democratic institutions, while under pressure, are generally stronger and more interconnected across Europe today. And you have bodies like the EU, NATO, providing a kind of stability framework, a support network that didn't exist in the same way back then.
Let's dig into that history a bit more.
Yeah.
The French Revolution, you mentioned bread prices. The sources really stress how the government just couldn't control food costs that winter.
1788, yeah. A brutal winter.
And that directly led to riots in Paris, fueled the whole revolution. Shows how basic economic needs can just explode socially.
Absolutely. And it's a recurring theme, isn't it? The link between severe economic pain and political instability. The Great Depression, the sources say, worsened divisions in Spain contributed to the Spanish Civil War.
And Germany after World War I, the blockades, the hyperinflation.
Utter chaos. Mass strikes. It just gutted the democratic system, paved the way for radicalism.
So those are the really extreme cases. But the sources also mention more recent stuff within the EU, right? France, 68, Poland in the 80s.
Yeah, solidarity movement, student protests, driven by labor issues, economic problems. But the key difference there, it seems, is that the political systems, though shaken, ultimately held. They didn't collapse.
That seems like the critical distinction then. Economic shocks, social grievances can definitely destabilize things. No question.
But today's institutions in Europe are generally more robust, more interconnected. Plus you have the EU, NATO acting as stabilizers.
That seems to be the consensus view, yeah. Stronger guardrails, perhaps.
Okay, so to get a bit more granular, the sources had that table, right? Comparing a few key countries.
Yeah, looking at France, Germany, Spain, Italy, the UK, Poland, Belgium. Approximate inflation rates for 22-23, examples of major protests, and then the 2023 terrorism stats, attacks, and arrests.
And what jumped out from that data?
Well, you could see a kind of correlation, seemed like, between higher inflation and more significant protests in places like France, Germany, the UK,
Makes sense.
and also the terrorism arrests. They were quite concentrated in the larger countries. Spain, France, Belgium, Germany had the bulk of them in 2023.
We should probably mention, too, that data like this can have gaps, or sometimes it's reported slightly differently by different agencies or countries.
Oh, absolutely. It's never a perfect picture across the board. You have to account for those limitations. But even so, the data seems to roughly support the bigger trends we've discussed. The link between economic pain and unrest, and the ongoing extremist concerns in certain areas.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It aligns with the broader narrative from the experts and the risk reports.
Okay. So wrapping up this deep dive, the main takeaway seems to be Europe isn't really teetering on the brink of civil war, not in the way we might imagine it historically.
Right, widespread conflict seems unlikely based on current expert views.
But we are definitely in a period of heightened social turbulence. It's this potent mix, economic anxiety, the whole immigration debate, plus this growing political polarization, creating a really volatile atmosphere.
That sums it up well. Yeah, large-scale conflict, probably not. But localized unrest, bursts of violence, that risk is definitely elevated, especially in those areas facing the worst economic strain and the deepest political divides.
And these aren't just blips, are they? The underlying pressures don't seem to be going away quickly.
No, doesn't look like it in the immediate future.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it,
Yeah.
about the relationship between governments and citizens right now. With all this economic worry, these shifting social values, how that relationship evolves feels absolutely crucial for the continent's future stability. Definitely something to keep watching, keep thinking about those deeper dynamics at play.